In terms of the differences among Latin American countries, size is a big one. Brazil occupies half of the South American continent, and Mexico is also very large. Both of these countries also have very large markets with well-established economic relations. Colombia, Argentina, Peru, and Venezuela are smaller than these major countries, and Chile has a low population but a high economic weight due to its high standard of living. Around a quarter of Latin American citizens live in sovereign nations, so smaller areas, and large disparities of wealth and well-being exist within and between Latin American countries. Many people who appear middle class by international norms still experience poverty and deprivation in Latin America. The Southern Cone countries of Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay hold high global rankings in terms of social development, while smaller countries are worse off, particularly those with high populations of indigenous people. A commonality among these countries is the Spanish and Portuguese colonizers imposing of their language, religion, social institutions on these indigenous Americans and enslaved Africans. And all of these countries experienced similar processes of conquest and colonization. They became independent mostly in the same way around the same time, and they struggled with similar problems in similar ways. In terms of the indigenous people's encounter with the colonizers, at the moment of the encounter, most of Latin America was inhabited by non-sedentary people who were mainly hunters and gatherers, and semi-sedentary people who were mainly forest people whose agricultural practices were adapted to thin tropical soils. Most of Latin American citizens today are descendants of sedentary farmers who had permanent settlements with highly complex societies, and the most notable of these empires are the Aztec, Inca, and Maya. The encounter shifted the indigenous community's way of living to a much more complex societal structure. And when these enslaved Africans and indigenous people accepted the colonizers' true religion, they accepted their status as newcomers to the truth, which the colonizers then used this to impose damages to the people at the bottom of the social ladder through hegemony. Examples of these hegemonic practices include the Inquisition, keeping a list of banned books that people weren't allowed to read, and the church's control of work, rest, and prayer time. In addition to this religious authority, patriarchy was also enforced to construct the male hierarchy of the church. Husbands had legal control over their wives and children, and through this ruling style, the lowest class stayed at the bottom and accepted their inferior positions as they were given no voice. And then, as opposed to the core areas with a lot to export and higher populations, the fringe areas had citizens at the bottom. Though in the fringe areas, their citizens that were at the bottom of the social hierarchy, such as those of mixed race, they got a little more respect and became more important, and the slaves received better treatment since their replacement price was harder to afford compared to the larger areas, core areas. In terms of the colonial rebellions, initiatives for independence often came from native-born whites called Creoles, who experienced a lot of resentful competition with the peninsulars. So, in the rebellion sparked by the Creole conspiracy in Mexico's northern mining region, poor rural people flocked to the banner of the Virgin Guadalupe with their weapons that were farming tools. That's just like one example of kind of how the rebellions were. And Creole patriot attempts to engage indigenous fighters made slow and uneven progress. And the growing spirit of nativism, which means finding identity and birthplace, led to the unification of the Americanos, which encompassed everyone in the Americas. In terms of the Napoleonic Wars, at the time of these wars, the French revolutionaries were questioning their authority figures and the divine right they were being ruled by. So this ignited the belief of popular sovereignty in written constitutions. When the Spanish American citizens realized the government or central junta was representative of Spain and not the Spanish Americans, they implemented popular sovereignty. And this idea was adapted and influenced Brazil to join the movement. And the Latin American Wars of Independence were, their most important leader was Simon Bolivar. He was a major leader in that time of popular sovereignty and adapting those practices. So when these Latin American countries became newly independent in the 1830s and 1840s, the liberal emphasis on legal equality for all citizens had disruptive consequences in the societies that were still hierarchical and had exploitative labor systems. The liberals' fight for the government of the people was also pretty challenging, as the liberal leaders, which were typically white and upper class, had mixed feelings about who the people were, and they considered indigenous people a national problem in their lands. So church and state conflicts were also very prominent, and liberals called for freedom of worship and the separation of church and state, and they believed in public schools, and conservatives wanted Catholicism to remain the official religion of the new republics, and they wanted the church to retain a dominant role in education. So there was some clashing there. And throughout this gaining of independence, still some colonial cultural patterns persisted through this time, such as racism and social injustice. Those just persisted due to the hegemony and the racist social hierarchy of the colonial days. And while the progressive governments were supported, they excluded the indigenous people from equality. So that persisted as well. And then the idea of progress became a hegemonic idea. It became a hegemonic, idea in Latin America, because only those at the top of the social hierarchy benefited from economic progress under the hegemonic idea. So the idea of honor under hegemony, which was a measure of how well men and women played in their prescribed social roles, led to violent punishment of independent-minded women, and women were expected and forced to live under male control.